Right, numbers are starting to level off. So let's get started. So today we're going to be speaking about elevating your Salesforce DevOps lifecycle with test automation. Now, DevOps has been a really important topic in the Salesforce ecosystem for a number of years now. And in one of our recent surveys, we were super glad to see actually that 70% of the Salesforce ecosystem were using some kind of DevOps tool, which would have been a massive improvement on if you went 2 years back or even a year back probably. And test automation probably doesn't have that kind of adoption, but it probably should, because it's a vital part of the software development lifecycle. And ensuring testing is done swiftly but safely and comprehensively at the same time, so that deployments can happen rapidly, is extremely important. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ben McCarthy. I'm founder of Salesforce Ben, and I'll let Michael introduce himself in just a second. But I'm going to be your host today, so I'm just introducing, and I'll come back at the end to handle any Q&A. We are going to be, we'll do Q&A at the end, and you should have access to the Q&A box in Zoom. So feel free to ask as many questions as you like throughout the session, and we'll get to those at the very end. We are recording the session as well, so that will be sent out afterwards, just in case you need to hop off or you want to send to any colleagues afterwards. And yeah, I think that's about it. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Michael Dailey. I am the Director of Technical Product Marketing here at Provar. My role primarily consists of educating our user base and our customers and our prospects on the how our products apply to the wider ecosystem and how to get the most value out of them. But that being said, I do want to cover our agenda before I jump into our topic for today. Now, first and foremost, we'll be talking about why quality matters and why it's important specifically as it pertains to DevOps. Then we'll talk about what we refer to as the testing or the quality lifecycle and the different aspects of testing that there are out there. Then we'll talk about how automation can be achieved at scale, which is really the ultimate goal of test automation to begin with. And then lastly, before we get into the demo at the end, we'll have an overview of the Salesforce DevOps Lifecycle and some of the differences between that and the modern SDLC that we commonly see across the industry. So with that being said, just to kind of preface our conversation, this is going to be mostly educational. I do want to hopefully have taught you something by the end of today's session about testing and about automation and DevOps. But before we get into that, I do want to briefly introduce Provar as a company, just to kind of get this out of the way. Provar has existed for around 10 years now, and we've been in the test automation space from the very beginning. That's been our niche in testing Salesforce and testing end-to-end systems, with Salesforce being a key focus area of that. We do have customers and employees around the globe. So Provar for 10 years now in the Salesforce partner space. With that being said, I'd like to open our discussion today on why quality matters. And before we answer that particular question, there's another question that we need to answer, and that is, what is the primary goal of testing? Now, obviously, the knee-jerk response to that would be, we test to find bugs to ensure quality. This is kind of the obvious answer, but there's a hidden answer behind this question that I'm really getting at, and that is what sometimes people often miss is the major factor behind why we test is to reduce cost, because testing costs money, believe it or not. And the more you don't test, the more bugs you typically see in your application. So this graph here that I'm illustrating on the screen kind of highlights that fact that as you move through the software development lifecycle, you'll see an exponential increase in the costs that is associated with finding, locating, and fixing bugs in each development phase. Now, we all have bugs. Some of us may refer to them as features, but they're all bugs, right? They exist. But what really is the cost of a bug beyond just the monetary cost? There's a resource cost. There's a development cost. All these things factor into it. If we look at these development phases, they really don't tell the full story as well in terms of how much it's actually going to cost us as a business, because there's loads of different types of testing that can be done throughout the entire software development lifecycle. So again, the realistic challenge that we face here is, while we want to test earlier and test more often, this is definitely a QA best practice. It is very time consuming. And it can even cause us to slow down our release schedule dramatically if we just add additional testing into the release process. So before we get into some automation at scale conversations, I want to go through the different testing phases and what they are. So I've illustrated this with the testing behemoth. Behind this behemoth are all the different types of testing that you may be doing from a software and quality perspective that happen throughout the entire software development lifecycle. The first one, and probably the most recognizable to most of us, would be manual testing. This is what most folks are already doing in a lot of capacities. This is often seen as a necessary type of testing, especially if you're doing sprint-based development or agile development. Then your environments and your requirements are constantly changing. So manual testing seems like the only way to go, the only approach that can really meet the need of in-sprint testing. Now we have another type of testing that developers would be more familiar with, and that's unit testing. In the Salesforce space, this is commonly referred to as Apex testing, of course, because you're testing your Apex classes. But this is required for all Salesforce developers, of course, before they push their code. They want to reach that 75% threshold for code coverage. But really, unit testing is only covering the very basic and the very functional aspect of the code itself, oftentimes not actually testing your configuration and your end user experience. So we need to go to higher levels of testing. And that's where system testing comes into play. System testing includes two different types of testing as subcategories. We have integration testing and we have functional testing. Now, integration testing is exactly what it sounds like. You're testing how systems integrate. You're testing to ensure that they are transferring data accurately and timely between those two systems. And then functional testing is more about testing the actual functionality of your applications from an end user perspective. So you want to ensure that your regular scenarios are working properly, that there are no bugs on your applications at the surface. So then we go to a little bit of a higher level concept, which would be smoke testing. Smoke testing is really just kind of spot checking your application. You'll typically see this in smaller applications or smaller feature sets or smaller changes when they're being pushed. You want to make sure that something isn't glaringly obviously broken in the front end, such as users can't log in, they can't load basic pages, they can't check out, buttons aren't appearing on the screen, and things like that. It's a relatively low lift to do a smoke test, right? You just kind of log in and go through a very basic spot checking exercise. But there's a high benefit here because these are our higher risk scenarios to the business if they were to fail. This is, of course, another repetitive form of testing. So when we look at system, smoke testing, and some of the other ones that we'll get into, you'll see kind of a trend here of a lot of these being repetitive tasks. And that's where kind of automation will come into play. So another type of testing that some of you may not be familiar with, but it's very common in the Salesforce space, especially, we get role-based access control testing. And this is really looking at your permissions, your access levels for all your various users. You're checking your create, read, update, delete operations for custom objects for different personas. And that kind of leads into a more in-depth version of that would be persona-based testing, where you're testing more than just the security aspects of the end user, but you want to make sure that they're actually able to perform the regular day-to-day tasks as that particular user. Persona-based testing is incredibly valuable because it follows the same kind of methodology that you would have if you're doing agile story development, where you have basically as a blank, I want to blank so that I can blank. We're basically following that similar approach for testing. And it's very valuable because it tells you right away what your end users are experiencing and if those scenarios are working under those conditions. There's several different ways that you can go about this. One way is doing a BDD style formatting. For those of you that are familiar with BDD, those of you that are not, it is behavior-driven development. You'll see this in Cucumber and Gherkin, different styles that support this. But basically, it'll have this given when then syntax, which follows a similar kind of logic to the agile development. And really the goal here, to summarize for persona-based testing, is that you're testing as the actual end users. So because as we all know, testing as an admin on a particular org doesn't really tell you much because hopefully most of our users are not actually admins, right? Then we have UAT, or user acceptance testing, which is typically done before you deploy to prod or staging. It's one of your last forms of testing that you would do. And this is typically done by an actual end user in your application, making sure that they can perform their basic tasks, making sure the requirements match the changes in this environment. That basically what has been delivered was what was proposed through the entire software development lifecycle. Basically, they want to be able to sign off on this release before it goes further. Then we have something that's more specific to SaaS-based applications, and that's release testing. Anything that's software as a service is going to be pushing out releases on a regular cadence. So you may want to make sure that your applications, which are built on top of those platforms, function and behave appropriately. Particularly with Salesforce, of course, we have our three triannual releases. So we want to make sure that we're ensuring compatibility and compliance with each of those releases through this release testing. This can be quite a monumental effort for a lot of teams because they have quite a lot of functionality that they're wanting to test whenever Salesforce comes out with these releases that are impacting their orgs. And then the last one here is perhaps one of the most biggest testing types, if we're talking in terms of effort and scope and just kind of the scalability of it, and that is regression testing. And the reason I've used this illustration on the left-hand side here is to illustrate the fact that regression testing is really this monster of testing. It's highly repetitive. Of course, you're doing this every release, every development cycle, every sprint. You want to make sure that you're doing adequate and holistic testing across all of your applications to make sure that you haven't introduced any new bugs and that you haven't reintroduced bugs that you previously fixed. It starts out pretty small, as you would imagine, because you don't have any technical debt. You don't have any features that you're wanting to regress or make sure that you haven't regressed on. But as you can see, it's a growing behemoth over time. So regression testing is kind of one of the key types of testing that we'll clue in on as a candidate for automation. Now, why have I talked about all these different types of testing? You may be wondering, you may be thinking, that's a lot of testing, right? That's a lot of different testing types, and maybe you're only doing one or two of these today, which is okay. Not saying that you need to do all of these. And in fact, there's more than even I've gone over here that exist out there. It really just depends on what you're actually wanting to accomplish as part of your development, as part of your deployments, as part of your actual quality of your overall applications. Because the underlying question that needs to be answered, this is a question that we often get asked at events and webinars and different things like that, is what are some ways that we can improve on our software development lifecycle without sacrificing on quality? Because you'll often see speed and quality not being compatible in a lot of situations. So we want to solve that with automation and DevOps. Now we go into this a little bit further and we start talking about automation at scale. So we talked about manual testing at the beginning of the previous slides, and we talked about some different forms of testing that could be automated. Now we're looking at regression testing here specifically. So if you look at the bottom, the x-axis here, it covers a couple of different types of development pipelines that you may have. You may have a single release each month. You may have every other week or twice a month, and then you may have weekly releases or even daily releases in some cases if you're that mature. Now we can see here, all else being equal, if we were to run 200 regression tests across 3 environments, targeting about 80% regression coverage, this is kind of a typical trajectory that you would see for an expected return on investment if you were instead to automate those manual regression tests. So we see here, we start out, if we look at single release per month, we have about 3,000 hours in terms of actual testing time that's being saved. And then as you scale up, you can see additional hours are being saved with each kind of vertical there. So it stands to reason, of course, automation is widely beneficial across the entire Salesforce development lifecycle. But we talk about this larger process. Automation is only a small piece of that. So I want to get into the Salesforce DevOps lifecycle and kind of what are the differences in that experience and where testing fits in specifically with that. So this is not a new graphic. Hopefully for any of you attending today, you've seen some iteration or flavor of this before. I'm not showing this to talk about the usual things here, but really what I want to emphasize is that test is only a single stage in this process. I find this to be unfortunate because what a lot of people interpret that as, oh, we only need to test in this small snippet here. We don't need to test when we're coding. We don't need to test when we're releasing. We don't need to test when we're monitoring, right? What I'm proposing is that you should be testing throughout the entire life cycle, not just in this single phase prior to release. Because really what that only gives you is a snapshot into what's actually happening. So really the emphasis here is, again, best practice is testing more often, but you can't just keep throwing resources at a problem. The right way to go about doing things is not always just to assign more resources, because we're dealing with time constraints as well. So our main goal here is not to encourage you to test more, but test better. And to emphasize that we don't just test in this one single part of the DevOps lifecycle. So I want to drill this home with a point, or with a quote here that I've pulled out, and I've used it before in some of my previous sessions, but it's really just very powerful when we think about testing and the strategy behind how you test. And that is to test smarter, not harder. So I'll just read the quote here. It says, as ironic as it seems, the challenge of a tester is to test as little as possible. Test less, but test smarter. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to the best practice of testing earlier and testing more often, but it's not if you think about how you're actually going about your testing processes. Not to say that everyone's doing it incorrectly, but there's some different ways that you can improve without actually testing more, such as targeting higher risk-based scenarios. We call this risk-based testing, and persona-based testing, which are very high value, which are fairly easy to implement as well, because you already have the scenarios from those personas. It's fairly easy to turn those into test cases that immediately give you value and whether or not those are working from those end users. So that gives you the highest bang for your buck if I were to say, what's the easiest change that we can make? Now, let's continue on to the Salesforce DevOps lifecycle and discuss some of the differences that we've seen and that I've kind of seen through my career and looking at this. Although the stages are roughly the same, we have the same kind of development phases, right? There's definitely some nuances to the Salesforce DevOps lifecycle that I want to kind of illustrate that present some challenges when it comes to managing all of this. The first one here is the emphasis on declarative versus programmatic development. Now, I will say, as a developer in a past life, I tend to lean towards more programmatic tools, and I like doing things through code if I can. That being said, Salesforce makes a lot of things just flat out easier if you're doing it through configuration, such as creating a new field, adding something to a layout, creating a validation rule, flows, which of course are incredibly popular. But a lot of those things are very declarative friendly. They don't require you to be a developer. This is kind of against the industry standard of having control over everything that you do through a programmatic way. So it's a little bit of a different approach to the development effort. Then we have Salesforce's unique metadata-driven architecture, which means that all the code and the configuration that you're working on is treated as metadata rather than as files. Now, where this presents challenges is when you get into what is the source of truth. And if you're talking about Salesforce DevOps, that's probably one of the most important questions. Where is your source of truth? Is it the org, or is it your version control? Is it your repository? If you're looking at the metadata-driven architecture, this can actually be counterintuitive, because what we end up with is some metadata can be represented as files through the metadata APIs and Salesforce DX and other command line tools. However, it's not 100%. And there's always going to be admins working in your orgs as well. And those are not always represented as actual source rather than the actual org being changed. So this introduces some challenges when it comes to managing your deployments and your releases, as we well know. And of course, you have governance limits. Salesforce's multi-tenanted architecture imposes a lot of limitations on the resources that you can take advantage of, API calls that you can make, which can affect our development strategy for implementing features at scale, and also how we go about testing. Because if you're wanting to do load and performance testing, it's typically frowned upon to do load testing on a multi-tenanted architecture such as Salesforce, because they don't really give you the capabilities or the tool set to be able to do that out of the box. In fact, you have to put a request into Salesforce usually before you want to actually do this type of testing and they'll allow it. Now, that being said, there's some other things to keep in mind here that are not necessarily as Salesforce specific. Environment management is another one. Of course, we have different orgs in Salesforce, but these represent themselves in different ways. You have developer sandboxes, which can be, full sandboxes. They can be just partial sandboxes. You also have scratch orgs. And then, of course, you have your production orgs. So there's all these different types of orgs and environments that you're managing, which can sometimes behave differently based on the feature sets that you're coming out with. So you need to account for this as well. The mandatory code coverage I've already covered. Really, this is just for Apex. You need that 75% Apex code coverage for deployments before you can deploy the code. And then lastly, deployment tools, which is quite a big one. If you're familiar with Salesforce DevOps or you've been around the space long enough, you will have heard all the common tools that exist in the Salesforce DevOps space. I'm not going to go over them here, but really they give you a lot of capabilities that the Salesforce platform itself has been a bit weak on historically, such as change sets, not accounting for things and being able to do the same level of changes that you would normally do if you were using something that was like a Salesforce DevOps tool that was catered for that purpose. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that you can take advantage of from the command line using Salesforce DX, but using a tool tends to be a little bit easier for some of these deployments. Okay, so when we talk about all this, let's kind of frame it in the Provar big picture here. So let's bring this home and start looking at this and how we can evaluate Salesforce DevOps and Provar as a whole. So I created this diagram to kind of illustrate this. This is the Salesforce DevOps Lifecycle. And of course, it goes in a circle. It's very cyclical. But on the left-hand side, this is really your beginning stages where you have your planning, where you're defining your business requirements. Is something feasible? And the different things that you need to consider for Salesforce, such as declarative versus programmatic, using metadata versus using custom objects and things like that. Then we have the design phase, and this is really where you get into more integrations with Provar and Jira and Salesforce DevOps Center. And this is really defining your actual implementation plan for how you're going to create this code or this configuration for this release. This would be defining all of your user permissions, your profiles, designing around Salesforce's multi-tenanted architecture, and deciding on what your data model is going to look like, and relating all of your work items to things that you'd be doing from a testing perspective when we get into the integration phase. Now, if we move forward to the development and testing, kind of tackling those together, of course, the development phase is your configuration and customization. But I would argue that this could happen kind of in parallel with the testing phase, because you would be doing your unit testing. You would also want to be doing your system testing to make sure that everything is integrated properly before you merge to a higher level environment, such as UAT. So this would typically happen if you have a centralized developer environment, or if you have a QA environment or integration. You have all of your developer sandboxes working in isolation. Those can be merged and you could test them together to ensure that everything is working properly once it's been integrated. And we have different ways to integrate into these phases through our tooling, through Provar Manager, which I'll demo in just a second. And then we have automation, which is primarily focused on, of course, building out your automation for these scenarios in these orgs that you're wanting to deploy to. And then we get into kind of the latter half of this, and this is where you get into UAT, which is, as I've stated before, this is where you're testing specific user perspectives and personas and making sure that the flows, the permissions are correct, reporting and dashboards are usable, and the proper access is being granted to those users. And then from there, we have our actual creation of our change artifact, which historically has been change sets, but using third-party tooling, this would be using something like Capato or GearSet or FlowSum to basically package up these changes in some kind of a bundle that you can deploy to any environment. And if we go further to the deployment stage, this is where everything gets interesting, because once you create your deployment and you actually perform the deployment, this is typically where you would have regression testing through automation or through manual testing being done. You're doing a deployment to your QA environment, and you've already had a QA environment. Now you want to go and test to make sure that you haven't introduced any bugs by running previously working test cases on that environment. This is what we refer to as regression testing. And then the whole cycle repeats, right? So you can see here how Provar is kind of integrated throughout this entire Salesforce DevOps lifecycle. And we see kind of the role of automation throughout that process. Now I want to get into a kind of a high picture diagram before I jump into my demo of what I'm actually going to be showing for you today. And that is how we can centralize all this in a single application. In my experience, it's been kind of challenging in the past working with a myriad of different tools. And then you have kind of your testing team working over here in isolation. You don't always have a lot of collaboration. You don't always have a lot of insight into one side or the other. It's almost like this proverbial wall between the QAs and the devs that keeps them from collaborating and knowing what's going on the other side of the wall. A lot of times I use the illustration of the developers or the admins throwing over features over the brick wall and then the QAs trying to catch them and figure out what to do with them. Hopefully that isn't the case where you are, but we see that being the case in a lot of different companies. And kind of how we want to solve that is through our centralized quality lifecycle management tool that we call Provar Manager. This is our Salesforce native application that is hosted on the Salesforce platform on the App Exchange. And it basically takes all of the things that you would be doing in the DevOps world and creates relationships and integrations to those things to testing artifacts. So if we look at release management, for example, we have Jira, Azure DevOps, and other tools. We're basically creating a hub to connect your items in Jira to Provar test cases. So then you can say, from a development perspective, I'm working on this particular user story. Then I can say as a QA, okay, I see that user story. I can relate that user story to a test case and then run the test and then report back if there's a defect. And it's all happening in a single environment so everyone can see clearly kind of what's happening throughout the entire SDLC. And the same thing would happen for the DevOps phase. And this is actually where I'm going to focus my demo on, and that will be in DevOps Center and Provar and showing how the two are integrated and how we can automate a development pipeline using automation and DevOps. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we have all of our reporting and analytics, which is very important because after all, if you're not reporting and you don't have analytics on your testing, then it's hard to convince your stakeholders the actual value that you're getting out of the testing process as a whole. So it's good to have all that be surfaced and available to anyone who has access to your Salesforce orgs. Okay, so as always, feel free to leave any questions in the chat. I'm going to move on to our demo now. So this will be a short little demo to kind of showcase some of this in action. But as I'm talking through this, please feel free to leave any questions that you have in the Zoom chat, and we'll get to those as well at the end. Okay, so let me jump into our demo environment. Okay, so this is where the exciting stuff begins. So now we're going to start off in DevOps Center. Now I want to showcase something that was just announced recently at Dreamforce, and that is this quality gates feature that DevOps Center is introducing, which I thought was incredibly interesting and valuable for a lot of our users, because what it gives us the capability to do is tie certain quality metrics behind a release or a work item or a bundle of work items before we release it to the next environment. So as a tester, as a QA, as a DevOps engineer, it gives you the capability to basically say, okay, I want to define 80% pass rate for this particular release. And we can do that now in DevOps Center and Provar. So basically we can say, if it's not meeting that threshold, don't release it to the downstream environment, which is incredibly important because then that gives us greater controls of what we can automate and greater controls of what we're actually pushing downstream. And overall, you'll see kind of an increased quality over time if you follow these best practices. So how it all works. So we have DevOps Center. For those of you that don't know DevOps Center, I'll give a brief kind of explanation. Basically, what we have is we have our pipeline set up here, which is a pretty standard view of a pipeline. You'll have all of your different orgs that you've connected to. This could be different development environments, which could be Scratch orgs, developer sandboxes. And then we have a couple other sandboxes here, which are QA, UAT. And then finally, we have our production org, where we're going to be deploying to ultimately. Then if you look at the stage view, this will actually show us all of the work items that are currently in a particular stage and which stage they're in. And we get to a certain stage, we can set that stage as a bundling stage. So in this case, our UAT is our bundle stage. So we can deploy multiple work items as a bundle and version them to our production org. So this is pretty handy. Now it's pretty basic, but if you look at the work item view, what this work item object in DevOps Center gives us the capability to do, if we go through here, we can create a new work item. We'll just call it DevOps Demo and assign it to myself. And this work item initially won't have anything in it, of course, but what you can do is you can set a development environment for this particular work item. And this is kind of the key thing behind DevOps Center and utilizing source tracking to give you all this functionality. Because really the key thing that DevOps Center is trying to give us is, that we didn't have before, is a better version of chain sets, but also a way for developers and admins to work in the same environment and get the same result that they had before without having to have version control for the developers over here and then configuration in the Wild West over here. They're trying to make everything version control and source backed so that the source is more of the version of truth and you have the org kind of as a backup. But basically, we have connected to our development environment here. And what that gives us the capability to do now, and if we click proceed, it'll create a new work item branch to begin creating this new work item, whatever that might be. Now, what will happen is any changes that I make to this development environment, DevOps Center can detect those changes and I can pull them in and I can commit them to this work item and then promote them all the way up into our QA environment. So we give a full project management and release pipeline here inside of DevOps Center. Now, why all this matters from a Provar perspective with quality gates is what this now gives us the capability to do is link these work items and these bundles to different stages of the quality lifecycle. So if we go into Provar here, I'll kind of showcase a little bit of how this works. But Provar, of course, gives you a lot of different dashboards and reports out of the box. This is our Quality Center app here, where you can see kind of a high-level view of your tests and the status of those tests. But ultimately, what we're going to be doing is creating a relationship between that work item that we just had and our development environment that we're going to be working on. So if we look at the DevOps testing application, which is one of the new ones that just came out and currently in pilot phase, if we look at stage assignments, we'll see here kind of a similar pipeline stage view that we had inside of DevOps Center. If we go back here, we have QA, UAT, and production. And if we look at this here, we have a similar kind of stage view here. What we also have are these quality gates and test suites that we've added to these particular stages. Now, we've set all this up beforehand, and the good news is once it's set up, you can iterate on it and you'll have it there, and you can, of course, make it better over time. But in this first stage here, this is work item review stage. Basically, what this is doing is once this particular work item that we were building out here inside of DevOps Center, once it moves into the review stage, it'll create a pull request inside of GitHub for us with all those changes as part of that pull request. But it will also queue off this quality gate that's tied to this particular stage. Now, quality gate, as I mentioned before, is basically just setting a threshold for what you want to be allowed to be deployed. So I'll show you kind of what that looks like if we create a new rule here. We'll just call this test rule. You give it some description and you go to next here. And this is the interesting bit where we can set different thresholds for the level of severity. So say we only want to execute Sev1 test cases, we can set that as the bottom layer. Or if we want to do all, we'll just set it to info. We can also define the testing percentage. So this is the minimum pass percentage that we want for this particular stage or this quality gate in order for this to be released further on. So let's say we want 75%. This will basically say that, okay, if there's anything below a 75% pass rate for this test suite, then the quality gate will fail, and it's not going to allow us to promote that work item further downstream. And then we can allow for essential test case failures. So this will be basically another option to kind of give some more configuration there. But once you have that quality gate created, this is basically what it looks like here. And you'll have a list of different results that you've ran for all of your tests. So if we look at a previous execution here and go to this one, This was a previous test suite execution that we had for our test suite called Dreamhouse, which was basically executed on our QA environment. We can see here the breakdown of the pass fails of all the tests in that test suite. And then if we go to full results, we'll see the individual test case results here. What's great about this is that because DevOps Center is hosted on Salesforce and Provar is also hosted on Salesforce, all the results are kind of in the same org here. So we can access these results directly. So if I go to this result for this particular test case, we'll see here we have a link directly to that artifact on the Provar side if we want to take a look at it there. So everything is linked and everything is attached here and integrated between DevOps Center and Provar. Now, what this test suite was executed was basically once we promoted to QA, this test suite validated that that particular work item didn't introduce any regression failures into that QA environment. So if we look at our pipeline stage here, we've already promoted this particular work item to QA and even to UAT. So it's already been tested here. And in fact, we can see that our quality gate passed for QA. So if we look at our last kind of execution here, we could see that the promotion event on the QA passed, and we could see our start and end time there. So that lets me know that, okay, everything's looking good in QA. We're probably ready to promote this into UAT now. So then what we can do is we can actually it's already been promoted to UAT. So before we put it to production, we want to test it there. So what we can do now is we can actually run these test cases on our UAT environment to validate this deployment has been successful there. And we'll get the same kind of process. The only difference is we can define different quality gates and test suites for each stage. So for UAT, if we take a look at that one, what we actually have are all of our test suites we've identified. So we want to run all of them here, and we want to make sure that that same quality gate of 80% is met for that particular execution. Now, right now it's manual. In the future, this will be kind of an automated process, but because it's quite new, we have to execute this off manually. But if we go to one of our test suites here and we go to run test suite and we specify UAT, we click run, we'll see here, this will immediately kick off this entire test suite to run in our UAT environment, and it will report back the results on our quality gate for that particular test suite. So that way we can know right away whether or not these tests are failing in that particular org. So if we take a look at Provar and we look at pass run, we'll see here the UAT is currently in progress. This is the one I just kicked off. So this will finish in a little bit, but we can see some previous executions here. If we take a look at QA, I'll show you what this one looks like here. This was ran on a Windows machine, but it was ran in the cloud on Provar's infrastructure. And we can look at a test cycle here to get a breakdown of the individual test cases and what their statuses were. If we want to look a little bit further at that particular test execution, Provar gives the full information on its end here so we can see what that looks like. And then we can also look at the results to see each of the individual test steps and what their statuses were, as well as a video recording of that test being executed. So again, once UAT is completed here, it'll report back to DevOps Center, and then we can decide whether or not we want to promote this into production based on that result. Now, what DevOps Center is doing, of course, is quite interesting in those work items, is capturing all those information that we're doing. But let me take a look at this from the Provar perspective so you can see it there as well. So this is our automation application where we've actually created these test cases. So let's say I were to create a new test that I wanted to execute on the UAT environment. So I'll create a new test case here, and we'll just call this property validation. Because basically what we've done is we've added in a validation rule to the property object, and we want to verify that through automation. So we'll create a new test case to do that. Okay, once this loads up here, just give it 1 second here. Paused my Zoom. There we go. Okay, we can continue this. So we'll continue on. All right, so now we're in our Dreamhouse application from here. So we can go in and we can create a new property, and we'll show here basically this validation rule in action. So if I right click on a field, this is how we add fields or map fields as steps in our automation. We can just say prop name 1, 2, 3. This will refresh the page, making sure that we're on the correct screen, and then it'll go in and set that property name field accordingly. And now we'll see that validation rule has been enabled in the UAT environment, which is where I am. So if I try to save this record, it should appear. So if I click save here, what we should see is this validation rule is being hit. So what we can do in Provar is we can actually validate the validation rule. So we can assert this particular message on the page by checking assert message and copying it here, and add this to our test case to quickly add a way to validate that the validation rule is in fact appearing under these conditions. And then we can continue on and we can map an actual broker name here. So I'll just go ahead and add an existing broker I know exists in this particular environment. Right. And then we'll just copy our save button here and drag it to the end and quickly just go ahead and jump to that step and execute it. Okay, so there we have kind of a scenario showing you how we can do the unhappy and the happy paths for creating objects and validating metadata changes. So we validated that in UAT from our machine, of course, but what we would want to do in a real world is we would want to complete this scenario and check it in to our version control and also upload it into Provar so we can execute it directly from DevOps Center there. The good news is because we're mapping them at the test suite level, we actually don't have to change anything in DevOps Center to get this to work. All we have to do is upload this into Salesforce, and then we're able to run it as part of our pipeline. Okay, so that's kind of the end-to-end illustration of the demo that I wanted to show for you all. Go back into our slides here. And let me just kind of wrap up before we get into our Q&A. So first and foremost, we have automation. I showed you how we can update test cases, create tests and test builder. That was the last thing I just showed there, and how we can sync these into the cloud through version control and our Salesforce app. And from the manager and DevOps Center side of things, we showed how we can link our test cases to our development efforts and how we can trigger deployments from work items in DevOps Center, which in turn run our test cases on the cloud using Provar, and then ultimately decide whether or not to pass or fail those quality gates before completing the deployment to the next downstream environment. Okay, so that's kind of a showcase of test automation and DevOps with Salesforce DevOps Center. Hope you found that interesting. But that's the last part of our session for today. If there are any questions, I will love to take those now.
Hey, Michael. Thanks so much for that. Great session. I feel a lot smarter after having listened to you for the past 45 minutes. So yeah, great job. Cool. Let's go to some Q&A. So we do have 15 minutes left. So if anyone has any burning questions for Michael after that great presentation and demo, then please feel free to put them in the Q&A. But to get started, does Provar offer any free trials at all?
Yeah, good question. So for Manager, for the Salesforce application, you can go directly on the App Exchange and actually get a trial of it there and test it on your own orgs just directly without having to reach out to us. If you wanted to get a trial version of automation, that is going to be through our sales channels. So you'd have to contact our team and we can set that up for you.
Cool. Fantastic. This one just coming in from Barath there. I don't know if he's asking you to demonstrate something. I don't know if you'll be able to do that on the fly, but he's asking how to capture, or maybe a better way to phrase it is, can Provar capture and handle a conflict or failure during a Git merge or deployment process?
That's a great question. That's probably more of a question for how DevOps Center handles those merge conflicts. Provar, we don't necessarily have our own iteration of Git or anything like that, or merge conflict handling. What we have is an integration with Git where you can check in your test projects and your development. And then from DevOps Center, of course, they have ways of handling merges, but it's typically best done in the actual version control tool that you're using. So I would suggest, like, if you have a merge conflict in GitHub, handle it there. That's probably the easiest way.
Great. Thank you very much. Two-part question here from Alan. First part, are you able to test screen flow executions to ensure a UI click path executes the desired outcome?
Yeah, good question. Yes, in fact, one of the test cases that I executed as part of that pipeline was testing a screen flow. So that is something that we can do for sure.
Fantastic. And second part of the question, can you run as different users to check page layouts or dynamic forms?
Yeah, it's a great question. I covered persona-based testing, and I wouldn't have brought it up if we weren't able to do it. We definitely can run as different users. Basically, the way that it works on the Provar side of things is you'll create connections that log in as your different users that you're wanting to test or emulate. And then you can just continue using Test Builder as you saw me doing at the end there. So you just build it out as if you were that user. And then whenever you run the test case back, it'll run as if that user was logged in.
Great. Thank you very much. And another one here. So what are some common challenges teams face when trying to integrate test automation into their development process, and how can they overcome those challenges?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably the most common one that I see is teams working in isolation and silos and not having proper communication and handling that integration. Because oftentimes you have like your DevOps team over here, which may be setting up all of your DevOps tooling, your CI/CD, and then you have your testing team over here, and they want testing to be a part of that CI/CD process, but they don't always have the capabilities or the access. So I see that being a pretty common challenge, and I don't necessarily have a solution for you, but my best recommendation would be just to make sure that the teams are working in close collaboration and that everyone's kind of working towards the same goal in your CI/CD and including automation as an essential part of that.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And one from Seth here. Can you summarize performance test capabilities in automation and/or manager?
So performance testing is not something that we necessarily do out of the box, I would say. And again, that's kind of the restrictions on Salesforce governance and limits there. So that would be, because it's a cloud-based, SaaS-based application, there's only so much that Salesforce allows you to do. If you're wanting to do kind of the basic performance testing of like a single user and just making sure that certain pages are loading and, there's a certain time or an SLA that you're trying to meet for a particular scenario, we can certainly automate that. The challenge always is if you're doing that at scale, how does that work with automation? So that would be kind of where it falls apart, but doing a single one is no problem.
Great, thank you. And I think Dan's building a business case here because he's asking, why is test automation particularly important for admins and developers managing a complex org?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, it really comes into play in how much time you're spending on each release. One of our biggest metrics that we measure with our teams when we start looking at onboarding our customers and seeing their maturity over time is getting that release time down, but also reducing the number of bugs that they have in production. Because usually testing is not something that we do at the forefront of a release cycle, but at the very end. And it tends to elongate our release times and make us slower to respond to user requirements and requests. So if you can cut down on your testing time through automation, you can release more, you can release faster and more reliably over time.
Great, thank you, Michael. Those are all the questions we've had in, but we've still got a bit of time, so I'll just wait to see if any of our attendees have got another question. But just while we're waiting, a question from me. How is Provar thinking about AI? Like, I would imagine with the promise of AI coming, it's going to speed up, the actual coding and building of solutions. So, the code should be ready faster, therefore deployments can happen faster. So I would imagine testing becomes even more important, and it might even become a bottleneck if you don't have a slick process for it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it already is a bottleneck for a lot of people because testing is kind of one of the last pieces of the DevOps process that people usually focus on. Because manual testing, it's like, oh, well, we're getting by today. But, obviously we've talked about all the kind of ROI and stuff like that. But with AI, the most interesting part to me, I think, on all this is improving the efficiency of testers and also making sure that the tests that you create are going to stand the test of time. And
Mm.
Provar already has a lot of capabilities to kind of handle test maintenance over time, such as, self-healing and metadata locator technology to deal with changes in the UI. But the efficiency part of it is an interesting one, because how can we take basically a work item or a user story and create a test case from that? That's something that I'm particularly interested in, and something that Provar is interested in as well, is basically taking you from development to testing and test automation, very seamlessly without having to onboard, something that was code heavy or create like a lot of different test cases around a single scenario, just kind of giving you more out of the box to do that. And we already have some features in the application that allow you to do that, such as creating test cases from Jira user stories, so we can generate manual tests from those user stories. But translating those into automation is a bit more tricky. So that's kind of the next piece of the puzzle, really.
Yeah, it's gonna be super interesting. And so no more questions coming in at the moment. I'll give it a few seconds and then we might be able to wrap up. But I think something that we're noticing as well is just how complicated Salesforce is becoming. Like we've done a few surveys recently, and one of kind of in summary of a lot of challenges that people are having, it just is becoming more complicated. The thing that I always hear is, you make one change in Salesforce in some legacy org, and it breaks like two other things in another end of the system, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. And it's not ideal, but it's just kind of a kind of organic side effect of people having orgs that are a decade plus with all this customization in them.
Yeah, the technical debt is real, and I think we're starting to see some of the ramifications of that even in Salesforce, and the complexities of the base platform itself. I mean, it's just growing over time, and it's getting more and more complex and more of a beast to handle. So that regression monster that I was showcasing, I think that kind of illustrates that point. Like, this is a technical nightmare if we're looking at this 10 years down the line.
Yeah, definitely. Last question that's coming is just about the recording, and it will be sent around to everyone after session. So on that note, I think we're good to wrap up. So thank you so much for everyone for attending today. Really great session. So thank you very much, Michael. Pleasure to collaborate with you on this. Any final words before we sign off?
Happy Wednesday. Stay safe out there. Hope you all learned something. Yeah, absolutely. Pleasure to do this. Thank you, Ben.
Great. Thanks a lot, Michael. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.